Okay, welcome to the Sumer Sports Show. Monday of week 7, moving into week 8. Thomas, we had a weekend of football games. Somebody told me a bunch of 1-5 teams won this weekend, right? We had a win by Chicago with a backup quarterback out of Division II. Shepherd. We had the Denver Broncos beat the Green Bay Packers. We had a lot of, sort of your New England Patriots beating Buffalo. We had a lot of like interesting upsets, teams getting off the schneid a little bit. And yeah, and of course we did have the Baltimore Ravens knock off the 5-1 Detroit Lions, restore the meow, unfortunately, as opposed to restore the roar. Thomas, just like quick kind of thoughts on the weekend of games so far.
Well, look, I mean, I was excited to watch. I was in between being in my garage working on my bikes at the same time, just to try to keep myself calm. Every time I watch the Atlanta Falcons, I get fired up one way or another. And we're going to talk about that game, right? I think, interestingly enough, watching the Detroit-Baltimore game was one that had me really intrigued by how Baltimore was rocking as they were, right? I don't know if you want to start with that game because I know you feel pretty passionate about that game. So maybe we dig in there.
Yeah, we don't have the stats review of that out yet, quite at Sumer Sports on Twitter. By the way, a couple hundred followers away from 11,000. I do just kind of want to talk about that game broadly, though, even though we don't have the stats review of it quite yet on the website. When I looked at this game, I saw it as kind of a battle between two coaches that many people, I think, want to have and will eventually be head coaches in the NFL next season. Mike Macdonald, the defensive coordinator from the Baltimore Ravens, a guy who was linebackers coach with the Ravens for a while, went to Michigan in 2021, helped that team go to the national, the college football playoffs, went back to Baltimore to be the defensive coordinator, has mostly been really good since joining that team back, bringing in Roquan Smith from Chicago, getting Patrick Queen kind of out of the struggles of his early career stuff, getting things out of Jadeveon Clowney that have been impressive so far, and dealing with injuries to a secondary, Thomas, right, where they've lost Marcus Williams for a time, they've lost Marlon Humphrey for a time, and now they're all kind of getting healthy. He was facing off against Ben Johnson, who's the offensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions, who many people believe would have been a head coach last year had he not returned to Detroit with a different contract. In this game, it looked like Macdonald got the clear better of Ben Johnson. I think it was 5 sacks, Thomas. They really didn't, I think the Ravens on the offensive side of the ball, if Monken really controlled the ball, that kept Detroit's offense off the field. But make no mistake, when Detroit's offense was on the field, it was a struggle basically the entire time.
Yeah, I mean, everything you said. First of all, I want to say, 5 sacks, 8 hits on the quarterback. There was something about that defense playing with just aggressiveness and, just this fired up element. And I contrasted that with Detroit. Remember, anytime you have a good season going, you're going to have one of those games where it just feels lackluster. And that's what it felt like to me to watch Detroit. They didn't feel like they're on top of it. I thought Jared Goff was kind of quite honestly reminiscent of what we remember him being. And we haven't seen that. That's kind of been out of the norm for him this year. So to watch him moving around, throwing one into the end zone, intercepted, just did not seem like that team was on the ball. And again, the whole Mike Macdonald, Ben Johnson deal, I'll be interested to see how that plays out this year. But again, I just stepping back and watching Baltimore, the way they were moving around, and Lamar was on fire, right?
Mm-hmm.
Set such a tone there. I think the whole day was fired up, though. Didn't they have a whole bunch of ex-players there? Like, everything about that day for Baltimore was just jacked up.
A few things. Terrell Suggs, who was drafted, in 2003 out of Arizona State, was there to get, I believe, his name in the Ring of Honor, a player who helped them win a Super Bowl in 2012. Also randomly won a Super Bowl with the Chiefs in 2019, but was, one of the best players in franchise history. He was back. So then obviously a lot of the other players with him that played with him were back. That was big. Sean brings up a great point. Baltimore in the passing game was averaging about 3/4 of a point per play, Thomas. When we get to, EPA on the website, you're talking about every 4 plays, you're generating a field goal on offense. That's incredible stuff. Beat Gamer 99. This is the part that I think was when I thought Detroit had a chance in this game. This was kind of drilled in my head, and I want to get your response to it because I think you've been parts of Falcons teams that were, I think, more talent on the field than maybe you were seeing in the results. They were a team that, they're probably undefeated right now. If they could catch a pass against Pittsburgh, they could have dealt with special teams better against the Colts. And yet, that was kind of my reasoning for why I like Detroit, because Detroit was very much a team where they kind of made every right decision. They're not as talented as some of these other teams, but they go for the right fourth downs. They catch the passes. They tackle the ball carriers. And I think the Ravens are a much more talented team, but you had a lot of drops. You had a lot of situations where they would kick field goals instead of go for it in situations. And so like the first drive of the game where they get down to the 15 and it's 4th and 2 or 3 and they go for it, I'm like, okay, they know what's serious in this game. Lamar scores on that particular play. Yep. And it just felt like this was the game that the Ravens were going to put it all together. I think the question that remains when you look at the rest of the AFC, right? The Bills struggling with 3 losses now in 1-score games. Cincinnati, coming off of a bye, but they're just 500. Kansas City is really the only team that's kind of taking care of business every week. Can Baltimore keep this up? Because if they play this way every week, I don't know if there's a team in the AFC that would be that would be favored against them, except for maybe Kansas City.
Probably Kansas City. I want to stay there, but I also do want to hop over to NFC North. I mean, I want to talk to you a little bit about that. I want to talk to you a little bit about your buddy, Green Bay, and your quarterback there that you're trying to get your head around. Can we for a minute here? Do you mind?
No, I think this is great. I mean, you think about the opportunity that was afforded the Packers yesterday, right? Because you come out of the bye 2-3. You're, for all intents and purposes, everybody had thought of this division as being wrapped up. Yep. Detroit shows some vulnerability in the noon hour, and now you have a shot. You have a shot to get to 3-3, to cut it to, a game and a half, 2 games in the division. You already have a loss against the Lions, but it's just 1 game. And I watched that game, and it's the same song and dance the entire time for Green Bay. They can't score in the first half of games. In the second half of games, they start to make plays when maybe things have let up a little bit. And Jordan Love is put in a position where I think if Matt LaFleur had his druthers, they would be ahead at those times of games. And instead, he's got to play the role of Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers, trying to help them come back. And it's simply not in the cards for him right now. What do you see when you see Jordan Love?
Yeah, and the reason I bring that up, I know it wasn't one of the games we were planning on talking about here, but this comes back to Detroit having a tough game and understanding they're going to get their feet underneath them again very quickly and come back. And it's not like in my mind that they're worried about much of – I feel like – I shouldn't say they're not worried. Everyone's worried every game to game. But, I mean, the way that Green Bay is playing right now and where Jordan Love is, and I'm still not convinced. And I know Jordan throws it out to people like you, me, who have some questions about whether he can take this home or not. I mean, I mentioned to you on my text to you, I mean, Matt LaFleur, good man and, good football coach, but he had a lot going in his way when he had Aaron Rodgers there. It's going to be really interesting to see how the darts go his way as things start folding in with Jordan Love potentially playing much more pedestrian than Aaron Rodgers would, and see how things play out here. So that's one of the things that happens normally with an organization when there's a switch up like that. And then all of a sudden people start wondering, okay, is it the proverbial coach or the quarterback? And before you know it, if it ends up being, both, like the quarterback not being there any longer and the coach is supposed to win games for that team and they don't win games, is Matt going to take heat? Will this become hot seat-ish for that organization? Is it worth it? From your perspective, analytically, do you think it's early to start wondering what's going to be happening in Green Bay?
I don't know, man. Like, I think this is not the first time we've seen a coach who had a lot of success with great quarterbacks face the music and it not go well. I mean, think about George Seifert was like one of the winningest coaches of all time. He goes and takes the Carolina job a few years later, and now all of a sudden your quarterback's Chris Wenke and Rodney Peete and guys like that, and it's like that's not going to work. Or you go to like, you even think about Jim Caldwell in Indianapolis, where like Peyton Manning's neck goes, and one year he's got to start with Curtis Painter and guys like that. And Jim Caldwell doesn't even make it. That's a guy that took that team to the Super Bowl in 2009, and all of a sudden he loses his job. I think that, the thing about Green Bay is people think about Green Bay as a loyal kind of like a, never fires anybody organization. Ray Rhodes lasted 1 year in Green Bay. You've had situations like Mike Sherman had, a decent run, but they moved on from him very quickly once Brett Favre started throwing interceptions and not, doing his job. Mike McCarthy was fired mid-season after a loss to the Arizona Cardinals and Josh Rosen at home. So this is not an organization that is going to tolerate losing. And they're not used to it, obviously, because they haven't been like consistently bad since the 80s. So I'm interested. I think Kirk Benkert, who I know you had in the building at one point in Atlanta, he said something to the effect of you can get by with a young quarterback and you can get by with young receivers. We're seeing it in Kansas City, but to try to get by with both, like Jordan Love threw a pass yesterday that if the wide receiver does anything veteran-like, come back to the ball, force a pass interference, catch the ball, all that stuff, they're in field goal range in Denver to win the game. And, Love, for better or worse, was playing with Devontae Adams, playing with, Cobb, Valdez-Scantling, all these guys that have made money in the NFL. And now he's playing with a bunch of guys that are on their first contract. And it's just like that mismatch. And then like you look at LaFleur as well, always has had a good quarterback and now doesn't even have receivers to go along with that quarterback, in addition to the fact that their left tackles making $20 million a year to never play. That's a lot of stuff for that coach to go through. And I wonder if he gets graded on a curve at all.
So with all of that said, swinging this back over to the Restore the Roar group of yours, because I know you love them so much. Is it any concern for them right now? Take a deep breath, meaning, is it any concern? Are they really that concerned what they're dealing with in their division? Is my question.
No, and actually because we have a tool for this on sumersports.com that if anybody is at all, if you're a Detroit Lions fan or you're a Kansas City fan, we update this after every single game. So we're going to go ahead and share the screen here. I know, Thomas, you were looking at this before. So here's our league table right now. We have this ELO, which is basically our power rating. We have the number of predicted wins. Notice here, we still have Detroit, Thomas, with a 91.5% chance of making the playoffs and an 80.1% chance of winning the division. That goes down a little bit if Minnesota, say, were to pull an upset tonight against San Francisco at home. But, for the most part, Detroit has put themselves in a very advantageous position. The other thing, Thomas, to look at this, and this is my favorite part of the tool. SOS stands for strength of schedule. Detroit, up until this game, has had a top 10 schedule in terms of difficulty, right? Yep. So the Jets have had the hardest schedule. New England, Giants, notice a lot of teams that have been struggling. Minnesota, San Diego, Arizona, Pittsburgh, LA. Detroit's 1505 is average. So they've had a harder than average schedule so far. But when you look at the schedule after 1461, that's the sixth easiest schedule in the NFL moving forward. Notice here, your Falcons, you wish you would have had this kind of slate in front of you when you were the general manager. Although the Saints have about as easy of a schedule, so it's not like they're going to get a break there. And
we're going to talk about that division in a minute, believe me.
But that's the thing. So Detroit, I think they learned from this mistake. Remember, Detroit last year lost like 30-0 in New England last year. They lost like 19-6 to Dallas. They've had games like this. And I think like the biggest feather in the cap of Dan Campbell is unlike Matt LaFleur, right? Where we're kind of seeing Matt LaFleur do a lot of things for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen Dan Campbell with his back against the wall. We've seen this team on the ropes, and they've for all of Dan Campbell's like quirks and limitations, he knows how to coach a team out of the miry clay, if you will. So I'm optimistic, but I mean, look, Minnesota wins tonight as a 7-point underdog at home, and they move to 3-5. Now all of a sudden, Detroit at 3-4. Detroit at 5-2 is now all of a sudden only 2 games up. Minnesota sweeps that series, and it's tied. So like that's kind of where I think, if you're a Detroit person, I think your biggest threat is actually the Minnesota Vikings.
Yes, and your comments about Dan Campbell versus Matt LaFleur, as far as grittiness, and I'm not just talking about the phenotype, right? I'm not talking about the size and all that. I'm talking about at the core. You could talk about Mike McDaniels, you can talk about people out there, whatever the grit is, it doesn't matter what their makeup is, but where is Matt LaFleur on his grit, and how will Matt LaFleur, as far as generating the grit within his team, if they take it on the chin for some games this year, that's going to be a big determining factor on how he's perceived by Mark Murphy and the group there, right? Yeah, and it's a big deal. It's a big deal when you talk about coaches, and you have a coach. I had a chance to be with 2 coaches who were both tough asses and both gritty when it came down to it, right? Yep. They'll take a shot in the face and they'll deal with it. That's a big thing. Mike was, when you start thinking about coaches and where they are and how they've been over their career, you look at how they dealt with things when they were coming up. Now it's a chance to get an opportunity to see how they survive through the tough times. That's a big deal, of course. So anyway, I don't want to beat it to death. I just will be really interested to see how that all works out in that division.
Yeah, and as somebody, I think the league is always better when the Packers are good. They have a great fan base. They travel well. I think like I said, I've always thought Matt LaFleur was really good. But there are different seasons in a franchise's life where it's one thing to take a great quarterback who's struggling and make him great again. It's an entirely different thing to make a quarterback who's never been great. And that is always, the struggle there. I think that speaking of quarterbacks, Thomas, who have never been great, in Tampa Bay, we had a battle between Baker Mayfield and Desmond Ridder. Now, it was more than that, right? Because we had, the issues associated with Bijan Robinson and his health. I'm going to go ahead and look at the stat review here for this game at Sumer Sports on Twitter. And here we're going to look at the Bucks, same sort of story, Thomas, where passing the football, not a horrible day, right? Baker Mayfield kind of in that 50th percentile here if you look at the EPA per pass, but EPA per run and success rate on early downs running the football, you're talking about one of the worst teams that the NFL has ever seen. Mm-hmm. Rachaad White, I think, made some really good plays out of the backfield catching the ball, but when they run the football to him on early downs, like notice here the graphic says they lost a whole touchdown running the ball to Rachaad White. So when I look at Tampa Bay, a plucky first few games, but you think about the turnovers they got in Minnesota, kind of the effort that they got from Derek Carr in New Orleans. This is, and then of course, Justin Fields struggling as much as he was early in the season. I think you start to look at Tampa and you're like, that was a team that was playing hard, but I don't necessarily know if they have the most talent. And then you look at the Falcons, who I think are more talented, especially, the drop back game. Desmond Ridder averaged 10 yards a pass attempt. There were the fumbles. There were the bad, rushing game, obviously, without Bijan Robinson being sick. This was a complicated game to analyze because I think ultimately the better team won, but I don't think you come out of this game, either side, thinking positive things about this team.
I just think that categorically, this is not the division of yore, right? Like, call it the way it is. This is a very different division. It has its challenges. And I came away from that game thinking, as much as I still think there are a lot of things that Atlanta needs to adjust along the way. I've said time and again, I think they have some good football players on that team. And my feeling about Arthur Smith is he can get things done, and he's got that team playing with toughness. And I don't think there's another team in that division who deserves, whatever the shortcomings are of Atlanta, deserves to be in the first place but Atlanta. And again, I look at Tampa yesterday, and it looked lackluster, and it didn't look like they were – it almost reminded me a little bit, and it sounds odd, but when I watched the Houston game, I felt like they were just kind of moving along, right? And I didn't feel like they had the same aggressiveness that Atlanta had. Look, 3 fumbles from Desmond Ridder, that's a tough deal. I believe it was 3. It was a critical fumble, of course, the one on the goal line. These are things that need to be cleaned up. But what I am saying is I just believe when it all comes down to it, I think this Atlanta team needs to be at the top of that division. Now it's, can they hold on to it? Or do they shoot themselves in the foot? Does Desmond have a game here? And does he have a game here, right? Do we get back a guy like Bijan Robinson? What a very different run game. And look, I've said this all along. I really like Algiers as a guy. I like him as a trudge workhorse type of player. But of course, you watch him after you watch an all-star, like Bijan, and you're like, this is a completely different cat. It's the same when you watch your ex-Minnesota receiver playing in the backfield. They're just very different, right? Without Bijan there. So Algiers runs, he gets what he can get, of course. But to me, that game was a back and forth game. It was a defensive driven game, of course, and that's where I was with it. I was disappointed by the way it played out.
It was a bad loss for Tampa Bay in the sense that, and this went all the way back to their Super Bowl year. The one thing that Tampa Bay can really hang their hat on is stopping the run with Vita Vea and like the linebackers being as good as they are, and Levante David and Devin White. And you catch Atlanta in a game where their best runner is sick. And so they're going with, as you said, Algier, a 5th-round pick from BYU, Cordell Patterson, who's really not a running back. He's kind of more of a, change of pace type of player. And so you catch Atlanta on a day where Ritter's going to have to throw even more because your run game can't hold up. And a lot of plays to London. Pitts didn't really do much until that very last play where he caught a ball and that Tampa Bay, I can't remember which safety it was, but you got to make a tackle at the end of the game. You can't just do what Marcus Williams did against the Vikings and shoot at him and miss, and then the guy's running out the back door for 30 more yards. It was that wasn't a great effort there.
Koo is going to be their most valuable player at the end of this season. I mean, he is a guy who comes out and he makes the plays, of course.
Yeah.
And, it's not that you want that, but how important is that to make sure that you have that dude popping them from 45 into 55. I think his longest has been 54. He knocked off a 51-yarder. To me, it seemed with assurance. So that's good for them.
Yeah, and we have seen that the new sombrero be a tough place for kickers to kick, and we know Koo has had his moments of inconsistency before being a Falcon, but for the most part since being a Falcon, he's been nails, and that is something where, especially when you're in that team building phase where it's not a great quarterback, run game, defense, kickers got to make kicks, and luckily for Atlanta, they got him into position twice in that game and were able to give him the field goal at the end. And also good on their defense for getting a stop. I mean, there were, Mayfield had 1st and goal, I want to say, and they did a really good job of forcing the Bucs into a situation where a field goal was their only option. Good clock management by Arthur Smith, who I think has at times this year been given a little bit of flack for how he manages a game. I think that he managed the end of that game pretty well. Even though, for the most part, that play to Pitts was a little lucky, they at least had the timeouts and the time on the clock because they had kept their timeouts and time on the clock at the end.
When he was walking off the field at the end of the game, you could just tell he had his lips kind of pursed, and you could tell he wanted to say, F y'all who have been challenging me, because he took a lot of heat the week before after the last loss. People were commenting about him holding his head like being confused. And I've never really perceived Arthur Smith as being a confused guy. Unfortunately, he was taking heat in town for that, being in Atlanta, of course. And, I think he came out of that showing like, look, We win games. He went. There was comments there, I think, from Mark Schlereth, right? God, I should know that. He'll get pissed if he heard me because we're buddies. But Mark was saying that he was very outspoken about this quarterback is his guy. And Arthur Smith has been very, very outspoken about Desmond Ridder being his guy. So that's good, right? Whether he's doing that because, and I'm not questioning that he's doing it mischievously, but whether he's doing it because he has to do that for the team to believe in Desmond or not, he's winning some games and he's losing some games. But it's a very good feeling when you're a GM or a head coach and you put your stamp on someone, to your owner, because I guarantee there's been talk this week about him prior to the game with he and Arthur Blank. That's a great feeling walking off the field when you pull it off, even with a tough fumble like that.
Yeah, I honestly, and again, like, so our numbers make the Saints with a 31% chance to win this division, the Falcons with a 47% chance. So they're currently the favorite. Carolina's a sneaky one in that they have the sixth easiest schedule moving forward, but they have yet to win a game. So this would be, a pretty monumentous feat for them to come back and make it into a contest. The one team that I don't think really has a shot to win the division is Tampa. They have a first place schedule, and Baker Mayfield is quarterback. I think that their bullets have already been shot, and it's nice of them to come out of the gate 3-3, but we've seen this, right? Chicago last year started 3-2, and then they never won a game. Like, this stuff kind of happens, right?
Can you answer a question? Why doesn't Baker Mayfield just run the damn ball the whole way down? He had a 31-yarder. I mean, sitting back there fiddling around and I'm just thinking, run the damn ball. He's a tough ass. Run.
Well, do you get worried sometimes because that team is a veteran team at wide receiver with Evans and Godwin? Do you ever get worried about, like, that's probably the answer to your question, is that Evans and Godwin have contracts that need them to get the football. Evans has his multiple year 1,000-yard streak, right? He's trying to go for 10 straight years with 1,000-yard receiving. But to your point, like, the best way for them to win is for Baker to be more creative. I think that, him dropping back and trying to be an accurate guy, trying to be a Brady of the world, maybe that's who he was coming out of college, but that's not who he is anymore. He's better outside of structure. He's better when he can lower the shoulder and get people who are on the fence about him fired up about him, right? That's the kind of quarterback he is.
What a great point. I mean, that's where if you're Baker or if you're, whoever, encouraging him to be creative, do interesting things, keep people on their toes or on their heels, I would say, and run and do whatever you need to do, because the way that you're going to keep a job in Tampa, at least in my mind, is to show that team that you're going to turn things upside down and you're going to win games that shouldn't be won. That game moving down there. I mean, are you kidding me? Any other team that's in that spot's like, oh my gosh, we're going to kick a field goal, or we're going to get an opportunity, we're going to win this game. I mean, their backs were to the wall, and all of a sudden they're just not getting things done. That's why, again, I just would have been creative with that. I would have run the damn ball again. I would have gotten creative with some flip, and I don't know. It was too pedestrian. It was too conservative in my mind, and I feel like they didn't put the best foot forward on it.
Yeah, back to the division at large, like next season, right? If you look at the lowest cap space, the Saints are $83 million, Thomas, over the cap. Mm-hmm. Chargers second worst at $43 million, Dolphins at $39, Bills at $29 million over the cap. You look at the Bucks are $49 million under the cap. You look at the Panthers are $47 million under the cap. The Falcons are $39 million under the cap. Like, I think when you look at this, and this is, an interesting way to handicap this division, I think the Saints view this year as kind of the last hurrah as far as like being competitive and, moving forward with this. Derek Carr is the kind of quarterback that needs support. And if you're $80 million over the cap, it's going to be Derek Carr and a bunch of kind of lower tier salary guys, right? So I think the Saints are going to weirdly do things that are going to be desperate, and I think that they're going to hard charge at it. If the Falcons can win the division in 2023, they're positioned well relative to their biggest competitor right now, which is the Saints. So this is a big few, like let's say month, right? If the Saints can make up ground this month, then maybe this isn't the year for the Falcons. But if the Falcons can just tread water like they did yesterday, I think that they have a lot going for them just from a structural standpoint. Now that's easier said than done. And we were talking about them as they won one game, but like this division is so bad that if you just tread water every single week, you're going to wake up one day in first place. And that's where the Falcons have seen themselves.
It's an interesting thought. And Ritter, of course, we're talking about fumbles and mishaps. Those are tough things, right? When it comes to the really difficult times, we've talked about that. But he had no interceptions, and he threw some darts in there to his credit, right? So I just, like you said, it's not like their quarterback situation in this division right now doesn't lend itself to being, obviously the steamy, strong division. So we'll be keeping our eyes on it, right?
Let's only review one more game. Yep. Chiefs Chargers was interesting. I want to get your take on Herbert, but let's talk about that Wednesday, because there is I got a message here from somebody in the league, and I went to Twitter here. The Eagles have traded for Tennessee Titans safety Kevin Byard.
Just today.
Just now.
Was there an injury there?
Well, that Reed Blankenship had been hurt. They had some players kind of, I know they lost Chauncey Gardner-Johnson in free agency. I think they were weaker there. And now they go with Byard.
Huh.
I don't mind. Kevin Byard's been one of the most, like, he's generated a lot of turnovers for the Titans. I also wonder, let's turn this over, because the Eagles are great, right? We'll talk about the Eagles game against the Dolphins in a second here. But let's talk about what this means for the Titans, right? Rand Carthon, one of your former scouts, now the GM, goes in, right? I think that the reports are that they got upset at John Robinson for trading A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown, by the way, the second player in NFL history to have over 125 receiving yards in 5 straight games for the Eagles.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Tremendous football player. But now Rand is looking at this thing at 2-3, I want to say, or 2-4.
I guess 2-4, yeah.
2-4. Ryan Tannehill banged up, right? Derrick Henry kind of seeing some signs of age. Offensive line not great. And now you trade probably a top 3-4 player on your team. I think this signals, and by the way, Jaguars doing well at 5-2, Houston doing well at 3-3. I think that this is a move towards the future for the Titans. Yeah.
It could be. Yeah. I mean, it's not one of those things. I just don't think whenever you're sitting in that position that you're looking to do it this early in the season. I think they are making moves for another time, of course, but I can't imagine, given Mike Vrabel, who he is, that he wouldn't fight to the very effing end. I was about ready to say it because that's him. He's a tough ass. And Rand's going to be leading, he's going to be following his lead, right? Remember, Rand came in as a general manager there, but he answers. He's not the final football say guy. He's going to be taking lead from Mike Vrabel, who's got all the power in the world right now after John Robinson left. And they're there saying, all right, what's going on with our defense? Can you pull up defense by chance what we're talking about? I'm very curious about this.
Let's go ahead and look at that.
This is interesting.
Here where we go to the league table at Sumer Sports, we go to teams and we go to filters here. I'm trying to make sure we just had an update to the website, so I got to make sure that this works here, or if we're already.
Isn't it under players? I thought I went to players before.
Yeah.
Defense.
I'll have to look because we are making updates as we speak to the website. So I just wanted to make sure there. When you look at the Titans from a defensive standpoint, we are we're pushing an update. Let me actually just look at some common statistics here. Okay. We look at team defense. Let's just look at, for example, yards per play, right? So you look at yards per play right now in 2023. We're looking at, Tennessee is currently 22nd in yards per play allowed. So kind of a bottom third of the league defense with respect to that metric. And then I think the other one that's really interesting is the Titans this season, Thomas, have gotten a turnover on just 6.7% of drives, second worst in the NFL. The team that's worst right now will surprise you. It's New England, has only produced a turnover on 6% of defensive drives. So a little unlucky, right? Because turnovers are somewhat lucky, randomly, play for play. But even like on a down-to-down standpoint, it's a little bit concerning, right? Defensively, where they are sitting.
Yeah, I keep going back to Mike Vrabel, offshoot of Bill Belichick and the Patriot paradigm and the Patriot approach, right? We used to say this all the time, everyone. We could win with good and very good players. We didn't have that many, like we weren't star-studded in the New England days, but we won. Of course, we were with Tom Brady, but we had a lot of really good, smart, tough, driven football players. Vrabel and Teddy Bruschi being two on the defense, right? I loved their approach. But we weren't sitting there gaga about trying to get the star factor. I've always felt that about Mike Vrabel and his teams at Tennessee, right? I felt that way with John Robinson, who's a good friend of mine. I never thought that they were a team that was really that worried about. They thought that they could play with good football players who were smart, dedicated, and driven. And here we are. How long can you do that, though? We've talked about it with Desmond Ridder, with Arthur Smith coming from that paradigm. Let's play with good, midline players at certain positions, and we can win. Can you truly win? Can you win into the playoffs? Can Tennessee win, to your point? Can they win with who's their star factor on that team right now?
Well,
Derrick Henry?
That's the thing. To me, it's Harold Landry and Jeffrey Simmons are their two stars, right? On defense. Abdulaziz Al-Jair, who played linebacker for the Niners below Dre Greenlaw and Fred Warner. He's a pretty good linebacker there as well. I know they moved on from Zach Cunningham, who interestingly is now on the Eagles. At corner, Christian Fulton's been a guy that they drafted high, but has not always stayed healthy. It's interesting, right? Because I actually had this discussion with a person in a team front office this week, because we were talking about like weak links and all this stuff and how it's so important to not have weak links. But the hard part is the only reason you can reference weak links is if your strong players are real, right? And you always talk to me about this, and I always somewhat push back, but I'm now moving my way more towards your opinion, where an NFL team needs to have a star players at important positions. And when the Titans have gone for star players, they've whiffed at times. Bud Dupree was a flop in free agency. Even Julio Jones, when they brought him in, was over the hill at times. And if I look at Tennessee, right, Simmons, Landry, Derrick Henry, and maybe Treylon Burks. If you're looking at like who are the players,
you might be reaching a little bit.
Who are the players on the poster, Thomas?
Yeah, on the poster.
I don't know.
Now wait a minute, you didn't mention a quarterback there. Why?
Well, because he's not. Tannehill's exactly Tannehill is who, like Arthur Smith, like that's Arthur Smith's head coaching resume is I got Ryan Tannehill to the AFC Championship game, leading the league in passing yards per play when he was not good enough to play for Adam Gase, right? Like that's the thing. And now Tannehill, and this is another interesting one again. So Tannehill's injured, right? So they had to go with Malik Willis. Malik Willis went over Will Levis. Like if you're not willing to go get that quarterback high and you settle for that Desmond Ridder draft pick type or the Will Levis draft pick type, like are they any closer to finding the franchise guy after using 2 picks on a quarterback the last 2 years?
I don't know that. And Will Levis, when you start talking about, by the way, what is his update injury related, or is he just not ready to play?
I think he has a high ankle sprain. And I have to. Okay, I'll look it up currently here because I know they were on bye, so I hadn't thought about it.
Look, let's just say this. I do believe this. Okay, I mentioned earlier, of course, Rand Carthon is a good football person. I've said this from the very beginning. He knows personnel. He'll put together the right team. Vrabel has to agree with what they're doing, of course, ultimately. So it's going to take both of those guys putting their heads together as they build into the future here. Back to your original thought. making a trade like this, that's a legit trade. And did it state what we're doing with the trade? What are they getting, or is it just
let me look and make sure.
Okay.
I'm guessing. I mean, Kevin Byard. Oh wow! So the Titans get Terrell Edmunds and a 5th and a 6th rounder. So Terrell Edmunds is a player that goes back to Tennessee. Hasn't been much of a player in this league. Was a high draft pick by the Steelers.
Yeah.
So not much in a return, right? You're basically offloading Byard's contract, which let me go ahead and look at that because again, they could be working on the books here more than anything. Byard had a $19 million cap hit next year. So that and most of that 9.6 and a roster bonus. So, Tennessee has to eat about $5 million in next year prorated deals and about $8 million following years in void. So they do eat something here as far as dead cap. They eat about $7 million or so this year, and then about another 5 next year. So then, about $13 million goes over with the Eagles. So the Eagles are taking on a decent amount of this. So I think it's kind of a salary dump as well.
Yeah, it's got to have salary implications, as we know. And remember, there are certain organizations that have an ownership or owner and or an owner group who are very light about it. In Atlanta, Arthur Blank was great. You spend the money he wanted to spend. He wanted to always be, I've told you this, he wanted to be in the top 3 or 4 every year. It was our part and his part of giving back to the Atlanta Falcon fan base. You have other owners on the other side of the world who are pushing their guys to make moves. Those aren't easy situations to be in. I would take my situation any day where Arthur Blank was so damn supportive of how we were going to put together and spend our money. Of course, it can get dicey at times because you want to spend a little bit more than you do. But imagine being on the other side where an owner's coming to you like, we need space, and we're going to be moving good football players. We never moved good football players, I don't believe, out of our organization because that wasn't our approach. We weren't doing that just to save money ever.
Yeah, you guys got a good deal for Mohamed Sanu in 2019, but I mean, you got a 2nd-round pick for Sanu, which you think about a 5th and a 6th and a backup safety right now feels like peanuts compared to that. Yeah. But yeah, even that move for you guys won in 2019. You guys won 6 of your last 8 games. And so you weren't not trying to win. It was just part of like a shrewd move on your part. This to me for Tennessee feels like that you gave it your best shot. You beat the Chargers, a good team. You kicked the hell out of the Cincinnati Bengals, another team people thought were good. You are a viable football team this year. However, you're up against a lot. Tannehill, I looked it up, has a high ankle sprain, the same injury he had a season ago, which put him out in the second part of the season. You don't really have a viable candidate at quarterback, and backing him up. Derrick Henry is losing a little bit of a step, you can say, and so it might just be a reset. Now, if you're Ran, I think you're happy to be a part of the reset as a part of the end of it. You're happy to be a part of the beginning, but still, I think it signals. You're the 3rd best team in that division, and you're moving some parts just as a fiscally responsible move.
Well, look, we could talk forever about this situation. Are we talking about another game?
Let's talk one more. Let's talk about one more game, Thomas. Let's talk about that game that took place Sunday night, and that was between the Eagles, who just traded for Kevin Byard, and the Dolphins, who were everybody's favorite team for most of the season. This was the first time, as we talked about the other day, this was the first time that the Dolphins were going to play a defensive front that was as fierce as what the Eagles had. And it turned out to be, a pretty easy win for the Eagles. Jalen Waddle went out. I think that hurt them a lot. They had -7 yards rushing in the first half, Thomas, did the Dolphins. Jalen Hurts still looks a little bit banged up, but they're so well coached. They're so good on both the offensive and defensive fronts. They seem to have gotten by this. What did you think of that game last night?
I mean, I just felt, again, it felt like one of those situations where personally I felt like Miami was just they weren't at their home, of course. They were playing behind all the time in my mind. I felt like Philly was fired up. I mean, look, Josh Sweat, he had 2 sacks. I mean, you're talking about one of the things that caught my attention is no flags on Philly side, 10 penalties from Miami, which to me just felt like they were spinning off in a different direction. However, you're in the middle of watching that thinking they don't have a chance tonight. I just didn't feel it. I wasn't feeling it. And then all of a sudden I look at Mike McDaniels doing some look on the side of the field, and then they toss one deep to a guy that no one can hang with. They just can't run with them. And here's T. Hill. There he is, taking it down. Intercept or reception like that for a touchdown. So they have the firepower to get back in.
Over a safety that's probably not going to start anymore because they got Byard. Like, I think that that is the scariest thing about the defense that a lot of teams are trying to employ now, right? Is that we're willing to give up 5, 6, 7 yards on the ground, but nothing deep, right? You watch the average NFL game, and there's no deep passes anymore because they play somebody so. And so if you're the Dolphins and you can steal one of these possessions by throwing a deep touchdown when the other team's just barely flat-footed, right? Which is what happened. Like, they had him doubled, but they were flat-footed and they score. Do you think, I mean, obviously Hill, when I think about the most valuable players in the league that aren't quarterbacks, is Tyreek Hill. I mean, Tyreek Hill is it's like Myles Garrett, Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, I think now. We're probably going to miss him tonight, but like Trent Williams, somebody like that. Like, those guys, I mean, Tyreek Hill just changes the complexion of the game because he makes NFL teams play ways that they have never played before.
He is pure talent. I'm not talking about characteristic and all. I'm talking about pure talent. Wow, he represents. I mean, it's so fun to watch him and his abilities. And I remember, this from being behind the Chiefs. I mean, and I hate to bring this up, and I'm not like digging up bones or throwing rocks in still water, but here's a guy in Kansas City took a ton of heat for that, right? Bringing someone in who had legit character issues. And Chris Greer, Miami Dolphins GM, pulls it out and says, let's bring him on here, to his credit. And they're managing him well. Maybe he's in the right situation there and he's doing everything. It's fun to watch him play the way he plays.
Yeah, a lot of questions about Hill because, for the most part, Andy Reid has not drafted receivers well. And so he was a random one that they took in round 5 that was immediately good, and they built the whole offense around him. And it's funny, and this is like a team building thing. For our, Sumer, it's like this, the Tyreek Hill can tell you a lot about a quarterback pretty fast. Mahomes, now Tua. And it's funny that the only team that in my opinion could trade a player like Hill and still win was a team with his quarterback as good as Mahomes. Every other team, I feel like Tyreek Hill would make a quarterback half as good. And even the Chiefs, it's not as clean as it has been because of how much he's able to scare defenses. But he's so valuable. The last person I want to talk about before we go, because I know we've gone long today, Myles Garrett, to me, is carried that whole game on his back. You're talking about 5 pressures, 2 sacks, a safety, a block kick, a batted ball. If for my money right now, the 2 most valuable players in the NFL that aren't quarterbacks are Tyreek Hill and Myles Garrett. And those 2 guys, Garrett basically single-handedly won a game for his team yesterday without Watson in the fold. I do want to talk about Watson on Wednesday and what the Browns should do because that thing looks a little bit rough. But this has been a fun recap. We got news right in the middle of the podcast, so that was good. That took us for a little bit of a loop. We talked a little bit about the Lions. We talked a little bit about the Ravens, Bucks, Falcons, Saints, as well as the Packers, and then we finished off with the Eagles, who just made a big trade for Kevin Byard, and the Miami Dolphins. Thomas, this has been a fun podcast.
It's been a fun podcast. We could go on and on. I know we had probably a list of auxiliary games to talk about. Can I finish off with Tush Push and 4 of 4, right?
Yep.
I mean, Philly shove, brotherly shove thing. I mean, did you see the head coach is kind of walking, and I laughed because he had that kind of this wry look on his face like after they had another, they just do it so well.
Yeah.
And that is unfortunately with the league, sometimes something like that is so good and they're going to have to be turning it over because it's going to go away. We know that.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, I made a joke that like Hurts is running like everybody talks about he squats 600 pounds. He runs like all he's done in the last 12 months is squat 600 pounds. He looks slow. Like this is not something that's not coming with this is not coming without costs.
Yeah.
He's banged up. And you look at Jason Kelsey, he looks like every tush push, I mean this in the most joking way I can possible, but he looks like he just gave birth. Every time there's a tush push, the guy gets up like he's just birthed 2 kids. And I'm like, this can't be good. It sort of reminds me, Thomas, and this is for everybody that's like, oh, this is ruining football. Your first year with the Falcons, your first year away from the Patriots, the Dolphins with Ronnie Brown, who had a pretty good arm, and Ricky Williams, who still had some spunk, they started running the Wildcat, and everybody's like, oh my God, this is going to take the league by storm. Right. They win the division. Chad Pennington is the next best thing. And it lasted a solid, a year and a half of being effective. Like these are things that, these coaches, they figure things out. They're not idiots. They move incredibly quickly, and incentives are a big deal. If they know they have to defend, the Eagles only have to get 9 yards for every 10 yards every other team gets. They're going to figure out how to close that pretty quickly. So,
well, I appreciate you talking about it and entertaining that. Remember, in Canada, there was a rule there about tandem buck. Look it up for all you CFL aficionados. Thanks for the time today.
Yeah, this has been fun. Okay, so for Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been the Sumer Sports Show.